Hello and welcome to another episode of Growing Up Gaming. This time we're focusing on the Sony PlayStation. My name is Greg Stewart. I am your host. Thank you so much for watching. So and then I choked on my own saliva.
Like to be humiliated by women. Here's your dream date. You are not ready.
So if you've been watching this series, you know we've been going through all the different consoles I owned when I was a kid, all the ones that I played when I was a kid, just sort of reminiscing about my memories of those consoles, as well as, when applicable, what effect they had on me as a game player and on my career in the games industry. So we finally made it to the Sony PlayStation. So the last time, if you watched the episode, was all about the Sega Saturn. So you know the Sega Saturn was my system. That was the one in the late 90s that I was absolutely on board with. I didn't consider the failure of the 32X and the Sega CD to be a reason to stop supporting Sega. But you know what? Even as someone who had my doubts about the PlayStation because of the fact that it was from Sony, and Sony was not really a gaming juggernaut at the time, you couldn't escape it. The PlayStation, I think, if you didn't live through it, you probably don't realize how much the PlayStation changed the industry, how much it grew the industry. The gaming industry was huge. The gaming industry calling out how much bigger it is than movies or whatever is not a new phenomenon. You were constantly hearing about how much revenue video games generated, even back in the 90s. And it was big, everyone had a Super Nintendo or a Genesis. And in the mid-90s, we were also seeing a bunch of other companies sort of jump on that bandwagon. I think even as early as that, you were hearing about Microsoft maybe wanting to get into video games, but you had Panasonic jumping in, you had Philips jumping in, Atari coming back, Apple releasing a game console with Pippin, and so everybody wanted to get on and sort of get a piece of the pie. But what Sony did, instead of jumping in and getting a piece, is they jumped in and made the pie bigger, is the only real way to put it. The marketing might behind the PlayStation was something else, and that's like the kind of where the story is going to start. So while I was dyed-in-the-wool Sega guy, you couldn't escape that the PlayStation was coming. You couldn't escape the feeling that it was going to be big. Right from the beginning, you were seeing a lot of comparisons. We were seeing images of Tekken. We were seeing Ridge Racer compared to Daytona. You were just seeing a lot of that stuff. You're seeing Toshinden a lot. You saw Toshinden compared to Virtua Fighter a lot early on, and while Toshinden wasn't a great game, it did look really good. And you had that, I'm going to say terrible ad campaign called "You're Not Ready," which, if you ever saw any of the when you heard it, it made sense, but when you saw it in print, it was so weird because it would just be written in like the bottom of a print ad or something. It was a URNOTE, so it spelled like Ernote, and the E was red, and then of course it was "You Are Not Ready," which I never, even when I understood it, I thought it was dumb. But anyway, yeah, so there was a big marketing blitz heading into it, and then you had Sega with its botched launch, early launch, and kind of just opened the door for Sony to just charge through and take over, and that's really what it did. But I personally wasn't on board with the PlayStation right away. I was working in games retail and rental. I was working at Microplay, I think, when the PlayStation finally came out, so it would be late 1995. And I remember seeing that shift pretty quickly from a sales standpoint and from a rental standpoint. People were just interested in the PlayStation in a way they weren't interested in Saturn. And when we did finally get the hardware, of course, we had the Saturn for a few months at that point. And even opening the hardware for the first time, like, it's hard to say. It's almost an intangible. I remember a customer who's actually a really good friend now, coming in after he'd rented the PlayStation for the first time and just saying how it felt like a professional piece of electronics in the way that the Saturn didn't. He was even talking about the weight of it and how it felt so solid. Same with the controllers. The controllers felt great right from the start, whereas, as I mentioned in the last video, the American Saturn controllers didn't. The American Saturn controllers felt cheap and flimsy and empty. PlayStation controllers didn't feel that way. So, yeah, I mean, the shift happened immediately. Sony was on top right away. Sega put up a good fight, but they were on top right away. But I did eventually get a PlayStation. I mean, I had, I was working at that point, and I had my own money. I mean, this was 95, so I was entering my 20s, and I loved video games, and I had to have a PlayStation. So I eventually did buy one, and the game that made me get a PlayStation, this is probably going to seem weird, although if you followed my content for any amount of time, this won't surprise you. The game that made me decide to finally buy a PlayStation was Formula 1. Which was released by Sony, I believe. It might have been Psygnosis. Developed by Bizarre Creations, which is sadly no longer a company. But yeah, it was just a licensed Formula 1 game, and I thought it looked fantastic. I wasn't even a huge Formula 1 fan back then. I just liked racing games. And so, not that there weren't other games that didn't make me interested in the PlayStation. Like, leading up to that, I mean, I was seeing things like, and I'm going to get release dates wrong here, but I was seeing things like Ridge Racer and Resident Evil and, Twisted Metal and Destruction Derby, especially Destruction Derby 2 had a big effect on me as well. Warhawk. Just a ton of big PlayStation, big PlayStation exclusives. But it was kind of like that critical mass along with this F1 game that I thought looked amazing that made me finally decide to get a PlayStation. As well as, we had Final Fantasy VII on the way pretty much at that point. I don't know that the marketing blitz had started by the time I bought one because F1 was in 96, so I think. So, it was late 96. So I'm sure the marketing blitz hadn't necessarily happened. I'm looking down at my phone, by the way. But we knew it was coming. And so I ended up getting my PlayStation with Formula 1. I think the other thing, though, that really happened early on with the PlayStation, and again, not that there weren't role-playing games on the Saturn, there were some great role-playing games on the Saturn. But I look at the time between the launch of the Saturn and PlayStation and the release of Final Fantasy VII as kind of this really cool sort of renaissance for role-playing games, and it felt like a lot of those were on the PlayStation. They were like lesser, if you look back on them now, not necessarily all of them really stand out, but man, I played a lot of role-playing games on that system. I was a an RPG guy as far as video games went. That was kind of like my main genre in the 90s. It had been probably since Final Fantasy 2 or 4 came out on the Super Nintendo. Like, I played a lot of different stuff. I enjoyed sports games. I loved racing games. I loved platformers, for sure. But I always loved a good role-playing game. And on the PlayStation, especially in those early years, you definitely had those. And again, it was before Final Fantasy VII came in and kind of changed everything. So I'm talking about, like, Suikoden by Konami was a big one. Still is one of my all-time favorites. I haven't ever really played through much of Suikoden 2, but I loved Suikoden. It was just this great sort of, felt like a pretty traditional 2D role-playing game where you gathered 108 characters. They weren't all playable, but you gathered 108 characters. And something about that game spoke to me. It had beautiful art. It had fantastic music. Red Book Audio was a game changer, which I've mentioned many times before, I think, on this series. Right back to the Sega CD for me. And the other thing that Suikoden did that I've always loved and still to this day love is that as you gathered characters, it would change once you got like your base, which was basically a rock in the middle of a lake that turned into a castle, but it would gradually grow based on the characters you found and who joined your party. And I've always just sort of loved that base building element to any game. I don't necessarily want to go in and be able to, pick where to put different things and build it at that sort of granular level, but just seeing the evolution of an area of the game or an area that you spend time in based on, collecting items or collecting people or whatever. Something like that. Something about that has always spoken to me. I don't know. It feels weird to base my love of an RPG on that, but it was a big deal. And then Konami again, also, I think end of 96 as well, released Vandal Hearts, which, again, I go back and I'm not a big strategy RPG player, but I loved Shining Force. And I've bounced off a lot of strategy RPGs since then. Shining Force kind of set the standard for me, and I think I'm always constantly kind of looking for that same level of depth and kind of no further. And Vandal Hearts really did that as well. Plus you added in that you had 3D worlds now, like the maps were 3D, you could rotate them and look behind things and that sort of thing. It was really gory. Anytime you killed an enemy, just like this huge geyser of blood, which, 19-year-old me, 20-year-old me thought that was amazing. And it had a really great story, a really good sort of a political intrigue kind of story that I enjoyed. And again, there was a sequel, Vandal Hearts 2, that was pretty well received. Not as well received as Suikoden 2, but I never really played it very much. I have it. I will play through it someday. I think it's on my endless backlog, but I never really played it. So, but still. And then the other one that I think came out around that era was Wild Arms, which, by the way, Wild Arms has one of the greatest full motion video intros I think ever, mainly because of the music. But yeah, Wild Arms, which was a pretty early fully 3D. I think it was fully 3D. The battles were fully 3D anyway. Role-playing game that, I don't know that it stands up today, but I really enjoyed it back then. And it was kind of like that. There were a lot of little, I don't know if you've even called a lot of them like AAA games, but it was like an RPG renaissance, which was awesome. It really rekindled my love for that genre. Not that I'd ever kind of stepped out of it, but I know that in the late stages of the Super Nintendo, there were tons of RPGs, and I didn't end up playing a lot of them. I think I kind of got a little burnt out after a while. I always had room for like a Square RPG, like Chrono Trigger in particular, and always happy for like Phantasy Star games and stuff like that. Phantasy Star 4 was incredible. But I kind of stepped away from it at that point, and I just found that that first year that I owned a PlayStation, the first like 6 months that I owned a PlayStation, I spent a lot of time playing role-playing games. And I also had the amount of time for it. By the time I got a PlayStation, I think I was living on my own, like not even in the same city that I grew up in, not even in the same province. I had moved to Prince Edward Island, and so I had a small circle of friends there because I was only there for a year, but I had a lot of time going home at night and spending time playing video games, and played a lot of role-playing games. And that was also around the time that we started Gaming Age, and I had started contributing to fan sites. In fact, that's one of the big things about the PlayStation 2 that really comes to mind when I reminisce about it, is that this is the first console that came out. It kind of spanned my whole, like, from a career standpoint. When it came out, I wasn't even writing for fan sites, and by the time it finally died and we passed the torch to the PlayStation 2, I was working in a professional capacity at Ziff Davis. So like, it was the first system that came out that kind of spanned that era for me. So I went from, talking about games on Usenet to doing fan sites to doing freelance to actually writing reviews, like professional reviews in Electronic Gaming Monthly on PlayStation games. So yeah, it's the first console that came out that kind of spanned that whole thing, because the Saturn came out around the same time, but the Saturn was really not a going concern by the year 2000. The Dreamcast was already out at that point, so there were Saturn games that came out while I was working professionally, but not many. And that kind of... Before we get to Final Fantasy, because I do want to talk more about role-playing games, but another sort of cornerstone game that came out on the PlayStation right around the same time, I think it was 97. Yes, it came out early 97, which was a big deal for me, was Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is a masterpiece. I don't want to say it defined a genre. I don't like saying that about sort of the Iga Castlevania era, which of course we know everything's called a Metroidvania now, because really Metroid defined that genre, I think. Metroid and Super Metroid. But what Konami and Igarashi did was take that genre along with a beloved franchise that had kind of gone dormant in Castlevania, and mashed them together perfectly. I mean, it was perfect. It had gorgeous graphics. It had amazing animation. The first time I remember seeing Alucard run onto the screen, I just couldn't believe how many frames of animation he had while he was running. And they had like the transparent shadows that followed him around, and that game it took everything that was great about Castlevania. It took everything that was, including the music, incredible soundtrack. I was just listening to it the other day, actually. It took everything that was great about Metroid-style games, and it also did a lot with what the PlayStation could do. Especially considering the PlayStation wasn't really considered a 2D powerhouse. That was supposed to be the Saturn, which it was. The way Konami developed and used the PlayStation for Symphony of the Night just made that console sing. I mean, it was incredible. It's still incredible. It's still supremely playable. It still looks great. It still sounds great. And I don't remember when I started importing games. I know I was importing games for the Saturn. I know I imported at least one Genesis game back in the day with Wily Wars, Mega Man Wily Wars. But I remember importing Symphony of the Night. I still have my imported copy here somewhere, because we were doing Gaming Age at that point. We were producing Gaming Age at that point. And I remember, like, we didn't really assign reviews so much, in that once we started getting industry contacts who would send us games, if you got one sent to you, you were just kind of expected to cover it, because we weren't mailing things around to each other. We didn't have that kind of money. And, or, you would sort of claim a review where it's like, I'm going to rent this, or I bought this, so I'm going to review it. I remember with Castlevania Symphony of the Night, I think it was the first time we had 3 or 4 reviews of that game on the website, because so many of us imported it. Everyone was so excited about that game that we just ran multiple reviews of it. And yeah, that's how I played through it originally, was the Japanese version. And I don't think I really played the American version very much for years after that. I remember importing the Saturn version of Symphony of the Night as well, and being supremely disappointed in it, because it did not perform well at all, although it did have extra content, which was nice. But yeah, it still stands up as one of my favorite games of all time. And another point, I think, where, as I've said, you had to own a PlayStation. You had to own a PlayStation. It was like an NES, more so than a Super Nintendo. I think people would make that same argument for the Super Nintendo, and I would say that that's not necessarily true. But I could see that argument. But for the late 90s, I think you had to own a PlayStation. That's just how it was. And Symphony of the Night was another great example of that. So, having said all that, of course, the other major game on the PlayStation was Final Fantasy VII. So, I was the same as a lot of other people, I think, in that when we found out that Final Fantasy VII was coming to the PlayStation and not the N64, I think a lot of people felt betrayed by that, because up until that point, Final Fantasy was a Nintendo franchise. Yes, it was Squaresoft, but you played it on Nintendo consoles. And I mean, Nintendo had even published the first one, maybe two, that came out in the US. So people were, bummed about that, especially because there's that famous demo of Final Fantasy VI characters rendered. I don't think they were rendered on an N64 because I don't think it existed when that happened, but they were 3D renderings, I think, on Silicon Graphics machines. It just seemed like Final Fantasy VII was coming to the N64. But anyway, it came on PlayStation. And I have to say, similarly to what I mentioned earlier, in that the PlayStation and Sony didn't grab a piece of the gaming market, they expanded the gaming market. And as much as there was a marketing blitz behind the PlayStation, the marketing behind Final Fantasy VII was like nothing I think the games industry had ever seen before. So Sony did publish it here, I believe. Either way, they were the ones who marketed it here. And I don't remember ever seeing anything like that before. You could not escape Final Fantasy VII. You'd see it, you'd see trailers running for it in movie theaters, you'd see commercials, you'd go into stores that had nothing to do with video games and see ads for the thing. We used to have Sony stores here. I believe they're a North American, I know for sure they were a North American thing. And the Sony store, I mean, you could buy PlayStation in there, obviously, because that was Sony hardware, or Sony electronics, and that's what these stores were about. But I mean, you go in there for, speakers and mini disc players and Walkmans and televisions and things like that. And you go into that store leading up to the release and after the release of Final Fantasy VII, and that's what you saw. Like, it was Final Fantasy VII. Years ago, I worked with a guy at a television station who had previously been manager at the Sony store that was local here in Halifax. And he wasn't a video game guy, but he knew I was, and we got to talking about it one day, and he called that out. He said the same thing. It's like, we pushed Final Fantasy VII so hard. We sold so many PlayStations because of that game. Like, he'd never seen anything like that before or since. Also, interesting anecdote was that he also remembers it being, Final Fantasy VII being one of the most returned products ever during his time at the Sony store, which I think had everything to do with how successful the marketing was, that a lot of people bought PlayStations and a lot of people bought Final Fantasy VII without ever realizing what they were actually getting. Because, of course, when you saw the ads, it was all about the CGI, it was all about the movie, the cinematic portions of the game, and not necessarily, you never even really saw the visuals, maybe the fight scenes, but that was about it. And, role-playing games, they weren't nearly as popular as they are now. Back then, they were growing, but they weren't nearly as popular. So anyway, I always thought that was kind of interesting. But the game itself, like, looking back on, I don't know, I go back and forth on Final Fantasy VII because I remember loving it when it came out, but also not loving it because I wanted it to be more like Final Fantasy VI. That's funny now looking back on it because I realize how similar it really is to Final Fantasy VI and the ones that came before it. Although it does mark, I think, one of the first major shifts in that franchise. Like, I would argue that the Final Fantasy franchise now in 2025 would be unrecognizable to someone who had stopped playing those games on the Super Nintendo. Not that the games were, like, related story-wise, but yeah, just the genre. They're not what they once were, for better or worse. I think probably for better from a marketing and sales standpoint, for worse if you want the old Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VII sort of marked that first shift where They were getting away from the swords and sorcery stuff a little bit. The cyberpunk sort of styling was so cool. But getting into 3D, it was still traditional turn-based for the most part, but just super cinematic, which again, they had been cinematic on Super Nintendo, but only insofar as you could be cinematic with, you know, little super deformed sprites. Here you could do fully rendered CGI cutscenes that didn't look anything like the game itself, but still looked incredible. But I will say that Final Fantasy VII is one of the earliest examples of seeing that cinematic CGI sort of cutscenes and backgrounds being combined with real-time 3D rendered graphics in such a way that they were starting to blur those lines. I would argue Resident Evil, the Resident Evil series, was probably the first one, at least on the PlayStation, that did that, and they did it really well. But Squaresoft sort of evolved the form a little bit, and they just got better and better at it. But yeah, like that opening scene for Final Fantasy VII just blew me away, and it still does to this day. You turn it on, and you have like that, you know, that CGI opening with Eris looking into the flames or something like that, and then the camera pulls out over the city and then zooms back in onto this train, which sort of starts the whole like terrorist attack basically on Shinra that opens the game. And the music is really upbeat, and you've never seen anything like it before. And it was super effective. It was super effective. And again, another one of those moments where it's like, well, I can only play this on the PlayStation. I'm so glad I bought a PlayStation. And further to that, I will also say that another company that combined sort of that cinematic style with the video and the real-time graphics was Oddworld. So Abe's Odyssey came out pretty soon after Final Fantasy VII. Essentially just a Prince of Persia game. But it was a really refreshing change in that it wasn't... I mean, it was violent. But Abe wasn't really an aggressor. He was pretty helpless through that game. And it had a beautiful style. And because it was 2D, it actually blended with the full motion video that they did even better than Final Fantasy did or Squaresoft did with Final Fantasy VII. And that's also an important game for me from a standpoint of my career, because we had started Gaming Age, and I believe it was either Abe's Odyssey or Age of Empires on the PC. But Abe's Odyssey was one of the first two interviews I ever did with game creators as a games journalist with Sherry McKenna and Lauren Lanning, because there was a huge push behind Abe's Odyssey. Oddworld Inhabitants was a new company, but they were being pushed hard by their publisher, GT Interactive. We had a really good relationship with GT Interactive. And yeah, one of the very first interviews I ever did was with Sherry McKenna and Lauren Lanning for Oddworld Abe's Odyssey. Looking back on it, that series kind of makes me sad. I really loved Oddworld. I loved the world they built. I loved the stories they were telling. For years, we used avatars on Gaming Age, and my avatar was Abe forever. And they had a plan when they started for a quintology, which was going to be 5 games, 5 stories set in the Oddworld universe that were all connected. But they kind of got away from it really fast because they released Abe's Exodus a year later, and it was because Abe's Odyssey was so successful that I believe GT Interactive pushed them to release Abe's Exodus, to release a yearly game. That was a really bad thing that started... I don't know if it started happening in the late 90s with the PlayStation, but it was definitely a thing in the late 90s with the PlayStation, which was, this was popular, so we have to get another game out next year. We have to just keep churning them out. And I feel like it derailed the grand plan for the Oddworld games pretty quickly, and that Abe's Exodus was not one of the 5 games they wanted to release as part of the quintology. I think that's what they called it. And so it kind of just threw everything topsy-turvy. Actually, the game that's playing on the screen behind me, Tomb Raider, suffered from that as well. Tomb Raider came out and was a huge hit, and rather than give them time to create another great game in that franchise, it was like, well, we need a new one every year, and it was just diminishing returns, which is a shame. But anyway, yeah, Oddworld. Loved Oddworld. Abe's Odyssey. Abe's Exodus was really good as well. It was a shame what it did to that series, though. Another game that I imported and that was life-changing for me, I would say, was Gran Turismo. Again, big racing fan. Obviously, I had bought the PlayStation based on a racing game that I was really excited about. And I remember, I think it was Marty Chin on the VidGames chat channel, IRC chat channel. He used to run an import gaming store, a mail service, I believe. And I don't know if he had gone to Japan for some show, like TGS or something like that, or if somebody else had gone and sent, because he used to... Okay, I'm going to back this up. Back in the day, before you could get a lot of video easily on the internet, this is way pre-YouTube, one of the things that certain people would do is they would go to trade shows, and they would videotape as much as they could, and then they'd package that up, and then you could order VHS copies of the videotapes that they created, and that's how you saw a lot of the stuff that was shown at trade shows, unless you were just looking at magazines and seeing still images. Anyway, I remember, I think it was him sharing, he used to do that stuff, sharing a video of a replay of Gran Turismo. So a race replay for Gran Turismo, and it was on the high-speed ring. And I vividly remember the shot. This is how important this was to me. Was a camera shot down a straight where the cars were coming up off a turn. And so I think they had 5 or 6 cars in a race. They came up off this turn out to the outside of the straightaway and came down towards the camera and then turned off screen again. And the way they moved was the most realistic thing I'd ever seen from a racing video game. And I knew from that little clip that I needed to play, and I needed to import Gran Turismo on my PlayStation. And I did. And so I spent a year playing that game religiously. I mean, I was, again, working, I was back in Nova Scotia at that point, and I was working at another games rental place called Gametronics. And the guy that I worked with, I remember he was really, really into the Game Shark. He was all about the Game Shark Code Creators Club, I think it was called. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. Anyway, played a lot of Gran Turismo. Took that with me. I think he'd imported as well. So anytime we worked together, we just had Gran Turismo running on a PlayStation. We'd bring our memory cards, because again, the PlayStation used memory cards, which was also pretty cool. That was a pretty new thing. So you could bring your memory card to work, put it in the work PlayStation, play Gran Turismo. And that's what I did. And yeah, played that religiously for ages and ages. And it was before it came out here. And I remember what that led to was my first E3, which was Atlanta in 1997. Which was, let me just double check here. Gran Turismo was December 97, so maybe it was 98. Anyway, there was an E3 I went to. I don't remember what year it was now. But it was when Sony was announcing and showing Gran Turismo for the first time. And they were running a contest where you could run one lap at Trial Mountain, and whoever had the fastest lap time at the end of the show would be awarded, it was a trip to the World Sports Car Championship race at Laguna Seca in Monterey, California. And I went to that E3, and I stood in line. The line was crazy. I skipped a bunch of meetings to do this. I stood in line, and I got up and I took my turn, and I set the fastest time. And I'm going to admit right here and right now, and anyone who's played this track knows, right before the start-finish line, there's a chicane. And if you play that on Gran Turismo 7, because they did reintroduce this track in Gran Turismo 7, you've got walls down each side of that approach. So you can't cut the corners very easily, and you have to take, it's a little like 2, I think 90-degree turns onto the straightaway. In the original game, that whole left-hand side leading to that chicane was just a field. And you didn't get penalized for just cutting it. So you could, and I knew this, and a lot of people I don't think did know it, because it was a new game for most people. So I cut a big chunk out of that lap and got the fastest time. And anyway, yeah, it was great because the time held. I went once because I did feel obligated to make sure I got to my meetings, even though we were just a fan site. But, you know, it's like trying to make it work, trying to make a career out of this. So I don't want to miss a bunch of meetings. I stood in line to do that one time, and it's like, well, that's it. If that holds, great. If not, well, I did my best. And it ended up holding, and I ended up getting 2 tickets to fly to California to go to this sports car race, which was a big deal, too, because I took my dad with me. My dad is the person who got me interested in racing in the first place. He had never been to California. I don't think I'd been to California at that point, but it was just nothing he was ever going to do. Like, he grew up on the East Coast, he traveled up and down the East Coast, and that was it. He never really went anywhere else. He never went out of country otherwise. So I got to take my dad to this sports car race, and it's obviously an historic track, Laguna Seca. So that was a great memory. I still have the pit passes we had. We had paddock passes on that trip. That was the first time I went to Laguna Seca, but not the last. But anyway, years later, well, a couple years later, when I started at Ziff Davis, when I joined Electronic Gaming Monthly, there was the art director at EGM at the time, which was Cyril Wochak. And if you're watching this, hey, Cy. I remember, I don't know how we got on the subject, but we were talking about that contest. And he talked about how he had stood in line, and that line was long. It might have been an hour each time. He had stood in that line over and over and over again because Sony would allow you to go and try this multiple times. You just had to get back in line. Over and over and over again, trying to get the best time. And he was talking about this one day and saying how he came so close to getting that best time. And that was when I told him, I was like, yeah, I was the guy who had the best time. So I'm glad you didn't do it. But anyway, yeah, so of course that kicked off a whole love. That game was, again, a complete, I keep saying this, but it's true, complete game changer. It changed what racing games were on consoles, even arcade style. Like, if you look at that post Gran Turismo, which honestly, you know, Test Drive was doing that stuff too, Need for Speed was doing that stuff too, but Gran Turismo was kind of at another level, and everybody chased that. And really, especially on the PlayStation 2, once Gran Turismo 3 hit, everybody was chasing the licensed sort of arcade / sim style racing game on a console, and Gran Turismo just killed it right from the start. And I mean, to this day, on my PlayStation 5, my 2 most played games on my PlayStation 5 are Gran Turismo Sport and Gran Turismo 7. I still play them relentlessly. And that also led to some cool stuff. I'll talk about that more on the PlayStation 2, but I actually got to hang out a few times and interview Kazunori Yamauchi, who's the creator. It was amazing. It's a big part of my life, but to the point that I can remember the exact moment that I was like, I need to import this game. And it was that little video clip that, again, I think it was Marty Chin, but I can close my eyes and I can see that video clip playing. It just left such an impression. Still going on this, again, big Cornerstone games. Another one that was only on PlayStation was Metal Gear Solid. Talking about cinematic games, holy crap. I was a Hideo Kojima fan based on my time with the Sega CD and Snatcher. Snatcher had been released on the Sega CD. That was a Hideo Kojima game. I had played the original Metal Gear on the NES, which learned years later that, he didn't like that version of the game. I loved it. I loved the idea of Metal Gear. So, I was super excited about it. I have, actually you can't see it, but right over here, I ended up buying the deluxe box set of Metal Gear Solid. Just crazy about that game so much. And it was cool because I feel like that's an early example of, again, that cinematic style that developers on the PlayStation could do, but without using a bunch of full motion video. It was very much in-engine all the time. Although when it wasn't, it was like all done with 2D illustrations that had a fantastic art style. But yeah, like, again, Metal Gear Solid was like nothing I'd ever played before. Fully 3D, the sneaking infiltration action, crazy story, crazy like anime style story that just worked completely. Great voice acting, which was something that, when it did happen, wasn't always fantastic. Like, I think back to Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Grandia on the PlayStation as well. Resident Evil, famously, although I think it was more on purpose, but just some terrible voice acting, because again, we were still in the infancy of having VO for our games, and you didn't always get it, but when you did get it, it wasn't necessarily great. But the cast in Metal Gear Solid did a great job, and loved it from start to finish. Just loved it from start to finish. And another example of, hey, gotta have a PlayStation. There were a couple more games, but now we're getting into, again, my time working professionally at a video game magazine. But a few of those memories are still tied up with the PlayStation. So actually, as I've mentioned before, and if you watch my Let's Read videos, the very first game I worked on to write a strategy for Expert Gamer, which is where I got my start in professional magazines, was Grandia, which was the Sony released port of Grandia for the PlayStation from the original Saturn. So yeah, like, PlayStation was the dominant console when I entered the professional games journalist industry. So I have a lot of memories playing and writing about PlayStation games. One of the other ones that I didn't really write about too much, but is, again, a huge memory for me, is when I did start at Ziff Davis, and especially started hanging around with my, still one of my best friends to this day, co-host of the Player One podcast, Chris Johnston. He introduced me to Dance Dance Revolution on the PlayStation, which I think I had heard about, but I'd never tried. And I think I actually went to his place and tried that, and absolutely fell in love with that series. Ended up starting with Dance Dance Revolution 3rd Mix. Bought a couple of the dance pads, played that game pretty religiously for a while. Lost a lot of weight playing that game too, actually. And to the point that we used to go out to whatever that Sega branded, it was like a Dave & Buster's, but it was GameWorks, I think it might have been called. It was the Sega branded version. CJ and I and Phil Theobald and a bunch of their friends would all go out every Friday or Saturday and just play hours of Dance Dance Revolution at the arcade, because we were cool like that. But it was fun because it was cool to see that grow into something that people actually cared about enough that Konami actually released a couple of Dance Dance Revolution games in the US. So that was kind of cool. But that kind of sort of points to the other thing that the PlayStation did that I think Nintendo had come close to as well, but it felt more prevalent on the PlayStation, is by the end of the PlayStation's run, they'd sold so many units that it became kind of safe to release really oddball games in North America. Stuff that people wouldn't touch because, at the end of the day, it's still about, how much are we going to spend on this? How much will we actually sell? Is this a good risk? And it felt like the PlayStation was one of the first consoles to hit such critical mass that you could justify releasing something like a Dance Dance Revolution, or Sony itself, or Parappa the Rapper, or NX with Bust a Groove. Really little, Tale of the Sun is another great example. These just little weird oddball games that, you could really tell that if we do a pretty small run of this, there are just so many PlayStations out there that will probably be able to turn a profit. That's really how the final years of the PlayStation seemed to me. And I was looking at it through those lenses, basically, because I was in the industry at the time. Anyway, yeah, talking about some of the other stuff that really comes to mind, covering PlayStation games while I was an actual professional critic. I have to talk about Chrono Cross, obviously. So yeah, the infamous 9.5. So Chrono Cross was like the follow-up to Chrono Trigger, which is a much beloved, for good reason, much beloved Super Nintendo RPG. So the buzz around Chrono Cross was huge because everyone loved Chrono Trigger and everyone always held it up as one of the greatest games ever made. And so it's like, wait, spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger on the PlayStation? Well, this is going to be amazing. And so I was one of the people, I was on the big review, which we had at EGM, when we kind of shifted things around to a 3-reviewer system. One reviewer had like wrote the majority of the review, and then the 2 other reviewers would be kind of like the counterpoints or just further information and that sort of thing. So I was the big reviewer. And I want to say Sam Kennedy was one of the other reviewers, and I think it might have been Mark McDonald. They both gave the game 10s. I gave the game a 9.5. In hindsight, I would say I was pretty generous to the game. Not that it's bad, but I don't know that I would call it a 9.5. I'd say Sam and I believe it was Mark were extra generous to that game. I also know I played more than they did. I never finished it though because I was playing a pre-release copy of it and there was a bug right at the end of the game. I shouldn't say I did finish it later. I never finished it because there was a bug at the end of the game that would not let me progress in the version that I reviewed. But never finished it for the review. But anyway, at that time, Mark McDonald was the reviews editor for EGM. So what that meant was that he assigned the reviews, he would lay out the section, and he would edit them. I mean, he edited most of the magazine, but he edited the reviews. And on the page where we would have our bios, he also would have a little blurb. There would be a little blurb about Game of the Month that he wrote. And so Chrono Cross received Game of the Month, which is to say it had the highest average score of any game we'd reviewed that month. And so it was shown at the top of that page. And he called me out in that blurb to say, you know, it's Game of the Month, it's incredible, but it missed the coveted Platinum Award, which we gave games that received 3 10s because of me, because I gave the game a 9.5. And then he said, send all hate mail to, and he put my Ziff Davis email address, which, I mean, you know, they were freely available in the magazine anyway, but he called it out and said, send hate mail. I received so much hate mail for that review for so long. Because that game came out in like 2000, I think, maybe 2001. You know what? I probably have it right here. It came out in 2000, August of 2000. And I left the magazine 3 years later. But my email address was still active. And I'm not lying when I tell you that some of the final emails I received on my Ziff Davis email address 3 to 4 years later were people bitching at me for that 9.5. So thanks, Mark. The other thing that I did have people angry at me about, and I think that it's totally fair, is that actually the biggest screenshot I used in that layout was a pretty big spoiler. Oops. So anyway, yeah, Chrono Cross. It's a thing. It was a thing. One of the best parts about working at Professional Magazine back in the day was press junkets. And some press junkets, some companies were better known for good junkets than others. Namco was really well known for doing some really exciting stuff. As an example, I went on a press junket with Namco one time out in Las Vegas, where they took us all to teach us how to fire Uzis. It's the first and only time I've ever fired a gun. It's pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. But one of the ones that I really remember, and I'll have more stories about stuff like this in later videos as well, but one of the ones I really remember was I got to go to Laguna Seca again for, it was a game called Jarrett and Labonte Stock Car Racing. Yes, Jarrett and Labonte Stock Car Racing, which was a terrible name It was a Toka game. It was a Codemasters Toka touring car racing game. But Codemasters had been trying to sort of break into the North American market with their Toka series for quite a while at that point, and I'm guessing they didn't have much success. So they decided, NASCAR was super huge at the time, so they decided what they would do was license a couple of NASCAR drivers and put them on the cover of this game that had nothing to do with NASCAR, because it was a touring car series, but put them on the cover to try to sort of goose the sales. And on top of that, and this is my favorite thing, is it's called Jarrett and Labonte Stock Car Racing. So Dale Jarrett, NASCAR champion, at the turn of in the year 1999, I think he won the championship. Terry Labonte and Bobby Labonte, between them had 3 championships, and I think Bobby was the most recent one at that point, because he had won, I think, in the year 2000, and Terry had won in like 84 and 96. Those brothers. So it's like, okay, Jarrett and Labonte, they're pretty big names, you know. At that point, Jarrett and Labonte had won the last 2 NASCAR championships when this game came out. But it wasn't Dale Jarrett and Bobby Labonte that they'd licensed. It was their kids. And I forget their full names. Neither of them they might have raced in NASCAR. They never really made it. But anyway, so when you look closely, it was actually their sons who were licensed, and they were on the cover of this game that had nothing to do with NASCAR. Anyway, that's besides the point. One of the coolest press junkets I ever went on, we went to Laguna Seca, and we spent the whole day, mostly in the infield. I think it was actually 2 days. We spent doing a bunch of different, we learned to do power slides. We learned to do a bunch of cool stuff. I couldn't even drive stick at that point, so I was really struggling with a lot of this. The coolest part of the infield day was they created a little temporary race course in the infield of Laguna Seca, and they put us in Dodge Vipers, and we raced each other, time trial style. We only went out one at a time, and we raced each other. And that was, I can't remember if that was the first or second time that I met Tommy Tallarico. Which, everything that's gone on the last few years notwithstanding, I'm not going to talk about that. I think anyone who follows anything that I do online knows how I feel about that. But I will say, back then, one of the nicest guys I've ever met. Super friendly. Remembered your name. He knew he was a good guy. And I think he owned a Dodge Viper at the time. And anyway, he ended up setting the fastest time in this Dodge Viper. And then I got my turn. And I set a time that was slightly slower than his by less than half a second. But he had hit a cone, and you got penalized for hitting these cones. And I think the cones were either 1 second penalties or half-second penalties. So I ended up beating him that day. But the coolest part about it was, that was a lot of fun. The coolest part about it was they put us in these little open wheel, I'd say like Formula Ford style cars, and let us go out and run the big track, Laguna Seca, including the corkscrew, which I have to tell you, even in a road car, because we did a track tour in a road car, I think that corkscrew is 2 or 3 story drop. So Laguna Seca, it's a famous track, and you go look it up. You come up the hill, I think it's called the Rahal Strait, maybe. And then there's a little chicane, a left-right chicane, but it's down the hill, and it's I think it's a 2 or 3 story drop. It might only be one. It's a lot. And when you're in a race car, you can't, because you're down in there, you can't see where you're going. You're just dropping. And I remember when they took us out on the track tour, there's a big, I think it's an oak tree that is on the infield right when you turn in to that corkscrew. And they made a big deal about the fact that in Toka, because the track was in Jarrett and Labonte Stock Car Racing, Toka touring car, that tree was there because the people who were giving us the track tour as we were getting ready to go out in these race cars had said, like, when you're driving, that is when you're facing that tree, that's the indication to hit the gas and drive out of the turn, was that tree. And for years after that, I retained that. And it was like, is the tree in the game? Anytime Laguna Seca was in a game, it's like, well, is that tree there? Is that tree there? But anyway, it was an amazing experience. It was the first time I'd ever driven a race car, especially an open. I think it's the only time I ever drove an open wheel race car. I'd raced karts when I was a kid. I'd taken rides in my uncle's race car at slower speeds. Like after a race, we would sit in the side of the car, especially if he won, and do like a victory lap and everything. That was awesome. But that was the first time I'd ever driven a race car myself, and it was on Laguna Seca. It was amazing. Anyway, very cool experience. I have a few more experiences like that, but the one other game that I want to talk about real quick before I wrap this up, because it is going pretty long, is, and this is just going to be short, is Ultimate Fighting Championship. And the only reason I'm bringing it up, I think it was the first time there was an Ultimate Fighting Championship video game. It was on the PlayStation. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, again, it was when I just started my career. And if you happen to own a copy of that game, well, you should go buy it if you don't. And go create a fighter. You can put my head on your created fighter in Ultimate Fighting Championship. And there are a bunch of games editors and also PR people who are in that game as created fighters. Dan Leahy, who ended up being the editor-in-chief of Expert Gamer and then Game Now before it moved out west, he's in there. Rob Fleischer, who was the PR guy, is in there as well. But it was also a cool press junket as well, because Chris Johnston and I got to go to a UFC event. We drove there. I think it was in Des Moines, maybe? I forget what state it was in. We drove to the event, though. And we got to have like breakfast with the fighters and just hang out with them. We were in the Octagon. We got to do a bunch of photos in the Octagon. There's some photos in an issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly where I have Rob Fleischer, the PR guy, in a headlock right at the center of the Octagon. It was very cool. And I remember it was sad though, because the event itself, I think there were two belts that were being unified. So there were two guys. The main event was two guys. They were each holding a belt, and whoever won they were gonna unify that belt. And I remember the main event starting. The two guys squared off. I don't remember who they were. And one guy charged the other guy as hard as he could as soon as the bell rang. Sent him right through the fence in the Octagon. And so they had to stop everything and fix it. I need to look up and see which event this is and see if I can find footage to play right here. And I think they stopped everything and fixed it. And then the two guys just stood there staring at each other every round until it was over. And I think I don't know if it ended up as a draw, but like nothing happened because they were both afraid of losing their belts. So it kind of was a little bit of a, damp squib, I guess you could say, as an ending goes. Still a cool experience though, and to meet a lot of the fighters, because it was all like one big family. It was really neat. And it was way before anything was politically charged like it is now. Anyway, I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. Those are just some of my memories of the PlayStation. And again, as far as my career goes, when I got into especially professional games writing, the PlayStation was the system. So a lot of my professional career from a games critic and games journalist standpoint was wrapped up in the PlayStation. An incredible system. Again, I can't say this enough. It really, really changed the industry. And so did the PlayStation 2. But the PlayStation, it changed everything. Especially in a decade where there were so many false starts, where, the 3DO died out, the Laser Active wasn't really a thing, the CDI wasn't really a thing, the Jaguar and Atari's reintroduction was a big bust. I went into the PlayStation era thinking that's what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden it took over the world, and it made the games industry so much bigger. And it brought in so many new companies that weren't part of video games up to that point. And I mean, we're still living it. We're still living what Sony did and what the PlayStation did for the industry. It's pretty incredible when you think back that we're in 2025. It's been 30 years since the PlayStation came out, and we're still hearing echoes of that console. It meant a lot to me, And I started out not even wanting to own one. And I can't believe, especially when you look at the huge library and the way the library advanced and the way the technology advanced during those years. It was incredible. Yeah, so, hey, you know, now we're on to my favorite part of doing these videos, which is to say, what are your memories of the PlayStation? What did you think of it? Did you own one? Did you get one right away? Did you get one later? Were you one of the people who bought a Saturn or an N64 and just stared longingly at your friends who owned PlayStations? Or did you even care? Or, like, is it similar to me, or were you totally happy not owning one? Leave your comments below. I love them. These videos always seem to generate some really great discussion, which is so rare on the internet nowadays. So please do so. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. The next episode of this series will be the N64, probably in a couple months. And until then, stay safe, be kind to one another, and thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.